It's like I'm trying to make the passage even longer. So we're supposed to be doing today Exodus 35 to 40. And I'm making it even longer from Exodus 34. I'm not going to read the whole thing. This will be a selected reading. So we're looking at Exodus 34, going from verse 29. And the big thing here is the glorious ending of Exodus, God's golden ending. Because we started in Exodus 1 in Egypt. To some, God seemed absent. They're enslaved in Egypt. And here in these chapters we see God is wonderfully present with his people. They can't deny his glory. So we'll just dip him back to, first of all, chapter 34, verse 29. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands, he was not aware that his face was radiant because he had spoken with the Lord. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, his face was radiant. And they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them. So Aaron and all the leaders of the community came back to him and he spoke to them. Afterwards, all the Israelites came near him and he gave them all the commands the Lord had given him on Mount Sinai. When Moses finished speaking to them, he put a veil over his face. But whenever he entered the Lord's presence to speak with him, he removed the veil until he came out. And when he came out and told the Israelites what he had been commanded, they saw that his face was radiant. Then Moses would put the veil back over his face until he went in to speak with the Lord. Now, turn the page to chapter 37 and see the golden glory of the furnishings of this big tent, this tabernacle, where God would dwell with his people. So chapter 37, verse 1, Bezalel made the ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. He overlaid it with pure gold, both inside and out, and made a gold molding around it. He cast 4 gold rings for it and fastened them to its 4 feet, with 2 rings on one side and 2 rings on the other. Then he made poles of acacia wood and overlaid them with gold. And he inserted the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark to carry it. He made the atonement cover of pure gold, 2.5 cubits long and 1.5 cubits wide. Then he made cherubim out of hammered gold at the ends of the cover. He made one cherub on one end and the second cherub on the other. At the 2 ends he made of one piece with the cover. The cherubim had their wings spread upwards, overshadowing the cover with them. The cherubim faced each other, looking towards the cover. They made the table of acacia wood, 2 cubits long, 1 cubit wide, and 1.5 cubits high. Then they overlaid it with pure gold and made a gold molding around it. They also made around it a rim, a handbreadth wide, and put a gold molding on the rim. They cast 4 gold rings for the table and fastened them to the 4 corners where the 4 legs were. You're probably getting the point. It's golden, it's glorious, it's for God. Turn 2 pages to chapter 40 and see the glorious ending of the book of Exodus. The glorious ending, chapter 40, verse 33. So chapter 40, verse 33. Then Moses set up the courtyards around the tabernacle and altar and put up the curtain at the entrance to the courtyard. And so Moses finished the work. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud didn't lift, they didn't set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel during all their travels. And so, at this stage, the glorious God of all things was with them all the time. You kind of get the point. It's the cloud, it's the fire. He's there. The wonderful apex moment at the end of Exodus. So let me begin by addressing the elephant in the room. I don't know if we can have the next slide, please, on that. The elephant in the room. Why are we doing 6 chapters in one sermon? That seems like a lot, doesn't it? 6 chapters. The basic reason is this: because much of it has already been done before in previous sermons. There's quite a lot of material in the book of Exodus that gets a second look. So some of the material that we've got in these chapters also appeared in Exodus 25, 26, 27, 28, and the start of 30 and the start of 31. So if some of it, when you look at it, seems familiar, it's because it's already happened in the book of Exodus. Which begs another question. Why does the Bible repeat itself? Why would the Bible repeat itself at all? Various reasons. The big reason is because it's important. When stuff's repeated in the Bible, it's often God's way of emphasizing, just underlining that, take notice, something very important is happening here. We might say, pin your ears back. Of course, the whole Bible is important, but there are certain elements that get that underlining from God with repetition. But also, practically, why else would the Bible repeat itself? Well, for the people back then, a big factor of what happened in the culture back then is to, we say, seal the deal. To seal the deal, there was often things were repeated to make sure that you absolutely knew these are how things are going to go, and we'll say it again so you're absolutely clear that this is what's going to happen. And the people of God certainly needed to know, what is God saying? What does God require of us so that we can meet with him and it be a good thing rather than us dying immediately? So it's very important that they knew exactly what they had to do. As we're ending our tour of the book of Exodus, here's the big thing today, the thing that's been building towards the end of the book is simply the journey from one thing to another, from how the book begins in chapter 1, where some would think, where is God? God's tangible. They could feel as if God was absent, if he was distant. And then you get to the end that we've just looked at with the tabernacle, this tent where God was willing to manifest his presence in a wonderful way. At the end, they could all see, as it were, with the cloud, they could see the tangible, real presence of God. That's a wonderful journey to go on. So we'll start with the start, God's tangible absence and distance, how it felt for them. Where is our God? If you remember back in Exodus chapter 1, how's your memory? Back in Exodus chapter 1, where all of God's people were slaves. All of them. And they were in Egypt. The cry surely went up from many of them, where are you, God? Why is life like this, God, if you are loving, if you are gracious like you say you are? We are meant to be God's people in God's land, under God's rule, knowing his blessing. But what do we have instead? We have Pharaoh over us. And what is he doing? He is systematically destroying God's people. And he's starting with the boys. If you remember, a lot of you will know this just anyway, about Pharaoh saying, right, you need to throw all of those Hebrew boys into the River Nile. Not for like, oh, well, here's an interesting way of taking a bath. No, it's so that they die. He's trying to wipe them out. And none of God's people at this point are in the promised land. None of them, as far as we're aware. They're all slaves in Egypt. They're under the heavy hand of Pharaoh. And as you read through the start of Exodus, Pharaoh increases the hardships. But if you know from when we spoke about that before, God was still present in Egypt with Pharaoh and all of that, working in the background his wonderful plan. But it didn't feel like that for many. As we journey through Exodus, we see much more of God's real presence and his closeness that the people see. Represented here by the tabernacle. But God's presence was not just there. You've got on Mount Sinai, particularly for Moses, where God's presence was spectacular. And in Exodus 24, the leaders of God's people, they see God, they share a meal, they see something of God, I should say. They see something of God. And they share a meal in God's presence. And in the passage today, things just seem to get better and better. Look how Exodus ends. Now, it's a surprise for me. I don't know if it's a surprise for you. You get to the end of the book of Exodus, and they're not in the promised land. You'd kind of think, oh yeah, all this talk of promised land. And you get to the end of the book of Exodus, they're not there. If you want to get into that promised land and figure out, what happens next, in your own time reading the Bible, I would recommend you read Numbers, which I know doesn't sound very exciting, and there are quite a few numbers in there, but there's also quite a lot of narrative story to say what happens next. And then read Joshua, and they are in the promised land. They're over the river. They're all the way in. So if you want to get into a book in the Bible where they actually get into the promised land, it's not Exodus, it's Numbers, and then it's Joshua would be my recommended route. So Exodus has some other high point that it finishes with, and we're going from God's absence to God's presence. Real presence. The stage is set, the tabernacle is there, and finally it gets completed according to God's command. And we get these words, which I think for a lot of God's people at that moment it was like, whew, finally. Exodus 40:33, where we read, and so Moses finished the work. Well, Moses is the figurehead. He didn't do it all himself, did he? But Moses finished the work. And then what happened? At the end of the book of Exodus, what happened? Well, let's look again, chapter 40, verse 34 to 38. And if you can, with this, just try and imagine it. Then the clouds, after the tent is ready, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses couldn't enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. It's just if you didn't get it the first time, The glory of the Lord is filling this place. On to verse 36. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud didn't lift, they didn't set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel during all their travels. Do you see the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, and everybody knows it. Everybody can see it. There's not a question about this. There is the cloud, there is the fire, there is the presence of God with his people. And there's a bit of a shift here, because the tangible presence of God has shifted from Mount Sinai to centrally, right in the middle of God's people. So from the mountain to the middle of the people, God is there. There's a real wow factor to it. The God of glory is seen, it's undeniable, his presence day by day. Which may or may not seem relevant to you, but the thing is, this is God's eternal plan for his people. For all those who've turned their life over to Jesus, this is what you're experiencing today, and it's the shape of your future. That God himself is going to dwell with his people profoundly, personally, undeniably. And it's going to be for your good and his glory. Anyway, going back to Exodus, what we have in Exodus chapter 35 to 40, how is it that ordinary human beings, like me and you, like those people back then, could get to live every day alongside the extraordinary God? How is it possible that they could be alongside the real presence of the God of everything, who is holy, holy, holy? How can God be in their camp and yet they still live? How is it possible? And the answer we've been getting from Exodus again and again is God made it possible. God wanted this. He arranged the precise details which we see in these chapters. And then God came down. God made the arrangements, and then God came down. Now, if you want to land that in 2024, what's left of 2024, are you ready to change your calendar? Okay. But we can land this while we still have some of 2024 left. Many today would ask openly and honestly, I mean, is there a God? If so, where is this God? Many will be there in Exodus chapter 1 going, well, if there is a God, it doesn't look much like it. What about you? Perhaps you'd take some convincing that there is a God. And I know if it's not you, certainly the friends and family you'll be mixing with this Christmas would be asking questions like this. How would you respond? Is there a God? Where is he? Today, how can we know God's real presence personally for you? How is it possible? Oh, the great thing is, it is possible. People in this room will tell you, it is possible. I do know this God. God still works to the same kinds of patterns that we see in the Bible, that we see in Exodus. That God arranges things so we can meet with him. The God who is there opens the door, but we have to come to him in his way, to know him. To come to God in God's way, which means, please can I say, don't look inside yourself for God. I know we're made in the image and likeness of God, but don't think you can just look inside yourself and somehow find everything there is to know about God. Don't look on the self-help shelf can't even say that. Don't look, if I can't say it, don't do it, right? Don't look on the self-help shelf. There's a tongue twister in the nearest bookshop. Please don't look into crystals, the nonsense that is crystals that's so popular. Don't look into clairvoyance. Don't look to being just a good person, because the first step was never for us to step to God. It was for him to come down to our level. How has God done that? How has God come down to our level? Well, we see it in Exodus. We see that God fashioned a way to be present with his people. But what about today? How is it that God has come down? And some of you might be screaming the answer in your head already. But did you notice Christmas is coming? And we are reminded at Christmas that God came down. Arranged all the details for centuries and before the centuries that we know that God came down. Now it certainly seems strange to us. I think it probably should seem strange to us that God could take on flesh and live as one of us. But there is one called Emmanuel, which means God with us. And we call him Jesus. God with us. God has come down. But how can we know God through, as we think about Christmas, how does that tie in with right now? How can we know God? Well, many of you will know, this Jesus, of course, didn't stay a baby. He grew to be an adult. And he made it clear how we can know God. Just one example of what Jesus said in the book of John, chapter 14, verse 6. Jesus made it clear how we can know God. And this is for all of our days, as well as the days when Jesus spoke this. He said, I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Father meaning God the Father, Heavenly Father. In other words, you want to know God, you've got to know this Jesus. Jesus has laid it out plainly. And if you understand that and lean into that, following Jesus, you get everything. These words are wonderful. This is, you're looking for the way, what's the truth, what is the real life that is truly life? It's in Jesus. He's become our way into knowing God personally today. Now, there is an objection with this that you've probably heard before. I certainly heard it, particularly when I was a teacher, and I'm, in the staff room, and we're talking about Christmas and stuff like that. And really, really intelligent person said to me, yeah, but aren't all religions basically worshipping the same God? Aren't they all somehow touching God, finding God? Isn't that kind of what's happening with all these religions? A bit like, here's a mountain, and they're all finding different ways to get up the mountain, like you would with a mountain, and they all get to the top. And they all and there's God, and it's the same God. Isn't that right? What's the right answer to that question? Well, I'm going to go with Jesus on this one, who basically says, no, that is not what is happening. Many are deceived and are not heading for what they think they're heading for. Because Jesus said, we have this again, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Which is, when you figure that out, what he's actually saying, it's got to come across, and it has come across to many as very narrow, and some would say arrogant, particularly when Christians, when we try to explain this, it's like, you're so arrogant. How could you say such a thing? To say that Jesus is the only way to God. And to be quite clear, it is an offensive thing to say. If it's said and it's understood, it is offensive, because it means that all the other ways that people devote their lives to is not the way. I mean, it's almost like dare you to go into the Derby on, get a big microphone and go, everything that you're living for is going to lead to a dead end unless it's in Jesus. It's pretty offensive to say that all the other ways are dead ends, which means, to be really clear on this, it means that Islam is not the way. Being a good person with good intentions, being the nicest person in Derby without Jesus is not the way to eternal life. Being a Jehovah's Witness is certainly, with their tampered Bible and their Bible lessons that are anything but, that they claim on almost every street corner, is also not the way. Mormons, you may have gathered, is also not the way. Being a very committed Buddhist who is learning how to meditate better than anybody else in Derby is also not the way. Do you see how offensive that is? How can Jesus say such a thing? Isn't Jesus supposed to be loving? But he's saying something that sounds supremely arrogant. It's Jesus not saying, I know of the way. He actually says, no, it's me. I am the way. That sure sounds arrogant unless you actually are God. If you are God in the flesh, all you're doing is saying, this is the truth. I have come from heaven to earth to die for you so that you get to go to heaven rather than to hell. It's just the truth. From Jesus, he knows what he's talking about. He's telling the truth. Put it this way. When God steps onto the stage of human history and tells us how it is, all other bets are off. Because he knows the truth. We can stop speculating. Is there a God? What is God like? How do you get to heaven? And we can stop saying, when I think of God, I like to think of him like this. If it's got nothing to do with Jesus, it's got nothing to do with the truth. Because Jesus is the answer to all of the big questions of life that really matter for eternity. God has come down. Now, there's another vital dimension to this that I think it's worth saying. Now people are going to get cross with Jesus. When they understand what he actually stands for, they're going to get cross with Jesus. And the response that works for me to that, when people are cross with Jesus, if you're cross with Jesus, narrow Jesus, please consider the cross of Jesus. You're cross with him. Have you thought about his cross and what it means? The one who says, I am the only way, it's me. He dies brutally on the cross to make the way for you. I cannot be cross with this Jesus because he took the cross for me. It's a bit like this, right? Picture the scene, if you will. It's only a bit like this. friends, they get lost. They are lost in a deep, dark, dangerous network of caves. And they know they shouldn't have gone down there. They know how it had been raining for weeks. And then the cave starts to flood when they're down there. And their lights, their torches start to fail. And they are completely lost. And they are all going to drown. It just seems inevitable. It's over. But then out of nowhere, there's a light. A stranger calling out. And he says, I've come from the surface. I've come from the surface to rescue you. Kind of seems like a suicide mission. Who would come into these caves at this time? And then it gets worse. The rock bridge to safety crumbles into the abyss below. All the rushing waters around them. What can be done? And the rescuer from the surface, he lays himself down across the great divide where the bridge had stood. And one by one, the friends, they clamber over the body, the frame of this rescuer, to safety. They can see. There's the light. It's the way out. And as the last one crosses to freedom, they can see the exhausted body of this rescuer tumbles into the darkness, smashing against the rocks. And he dies down there in agony. Now, do you think as they get to the surface, are they angry at the rescuer that he only offered one way out over his body? Just why did you only offer us one way out? No. They are grateful that there is a way. Neither should we be cross at Jesus that he offered himself as the one way on the cross, dying to save us in agony. Let's make this personal for us. Through this Jesus, we can know God's real presence, his closeness today. You can know God for yourself today. Yes. Take an example. Jesus said in John chapter 10, verse 27, he says this, "My sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me." When Jesus says sheep, he means his people, his followers. And this still happens today. We hear from the living God. We hear from God the Son today. We hear from God the Father today by the Spirit. How does this happen? The big way this happens is through this book. We get our Bibles open, as we've been doing today. We get our Bibles open. God's words are held here. The words of the living God, the God who is there, his words, we say, and it's his words are held here as he wanted them to be for us, so that we might know him. Now, wonderfully, many in this room have experienced the presence and the closeness of God, and they've heard God's voice in power from this book. Some are even nodding, because the Spirit of God causes this book to live today. Now, I know that to many in Derby, we can look like crusty, irrelevant Christians with a boring book. What are we, librarians? You like your books? What's wrong with you people? But hear this, our experience is to hear God's voice time and again from this book, to be moved, to be changed, to be more in love with our great God who has saved us. Oh, it's good. And we can echo the words of Luke 24. Those on the road to Emmaus, and they said, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? They're talking about Jesus when he opened the scriptures to them. And for us today, that's much of our experience. Our hearts burning within us while Jesus talked with us, with the scriptures opened. Now, do you want some of that? Do you want some of that? To be one of God's people, to know Almighty God, your creator, your sustainer, your rescuer, to know the nearness of the God who is there, the wonderful God who is there, to hear his voice. Now, there is a way in. There is a way in, and as I've said today, it's Jesus. We come to Jesus first. Now people live for all kinds of things today. They really do live for all kinds of things today. Or they don't even know what they're living for. Guy in McDonald's, works at McDonald's, really nice guy, right? He's always smiling. And he said, what are you doing? Are you a businessman? To me. I'm like, no, I work for a church. He's like, and I asked him, what's your thing? What's your thing? He said, I don't really know what it is. So some people know they're living for something. He doesn't even know. He can't even figure out what he's living for. To be a Christian is to turn away from all of that as your center point and say, Jesus is my all. Everything refers back to him and goes out from him. He is my life. And when we've made that turn, and God has brought that into our lives, then day by day, with open Bible, we hear God speaking, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Until that day when we see our God face to face. Now we're going to sing a closing song. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. As we think of turning our lives over to Jesus to know the living God today.